at the word. came out a few months ago. It'd be totally disingenuous if I didn't mention it, but it's based on my new book called Racism and Cultural Industries. I know a bit about the people you've had on recently, and I guess who are great and good mates. So, but I guess what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this discussion more squarely into the media, and specifically cultural industries and cultural production. It tackles a bit of music. I have written about music, but I'm going to talk more generally about the cultural industries, if that's okay. And if there's time, maybe we can just have a big chat about Childish Gambino and Stormzy. Have you done that already? Are you really bored of those topics? Well, you can never have it. You can never talk about it too much. But I'd be interested in deconstructing those two things in light of what I'm going to present to you today. This is going to be a bit more squarely based around media studies, but I hope that doesn't put you off, right? So first things first, one of the big things I argue, one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment, the cultural industries, I don't know if this is to its credit or whether we can, I certainly have more cynical reading about it, but it understands that it's got this massive issue with diversity. You must have read about this, right? I mean, not least recently we've had a string of beautiful men of colour talking in Parliament about what the lack of representation, what the lack of diversity in the media means. Not just in terms of content, but behind the camera, off the page, off the stage. When you've got the kind of mode of production of cultural representation in the hands of just, a very wealthy white elite, essentially. What implications does that have for society generally? Not least, what role does the cultural industries play in kind of shaping our ideas of self, our ideas about racial and ethnic others, about national identity and who belongs and who doesn't? What does it mean when those kind of things that the cultural industries produce in the form of cultural commodities, I hasten to add, and that's going to be a big theme of this talk, is that the cultural industries produce cultural commodities, which also happen to be symbolic representations of the world around us. That is a really interesting, is dichotomy the right word? I don't think it is. Hey, how you doing? Coming in. We're just talking about cultural commodities. Really interesting, right? But our understandings of the world. We read books, we listen to music, we watch films, we watch TV shows, and they give us a sense of the world around us. Even when they're even when we're talking about pure fiction, when we're talking about science fiction, right, set hundreds of years from now, they are still really revealing about how we understand the world around us, right? So I guess the point is, again, what does that mean when A, those symbols also happen to be commodities, there to be bought and sold, and B, what does it mean when the people making it happen to come from a tiny kind of portion of society, i.e. very white, wealthy elites? And like I said, we've had people such as Idris and Riz and my mate Lenny. He is my mate, actually. It's really weird. Something really weird happened in the last few months, but he's not weird. But Lenny Henry recently talking about the kind of media and in particular the BBC's relationship to diversity. He says so at the BBC alone in the last 15 years, there have been 29 initiatives to achieve ethnic diversity. And the numbers are actually 29 initiatives in the last 15 years. And the numbers are actually going down. Things are being done, but they're not really working. In fact, they're failing. People are leaving the BBC. People of colour are leaving the BBC faster than they join. One of the things that I'm really interested in arguing in my book is how these diverse... Oh, sorry, I'm just messing around here. I shouldn't have done that. Hold on. There we go. Is that all right? Yeah, one of the things I argue is that diversity initiatives, they're not... So what I'm talking about, when media companies set quotas or targets for the number of people of colour they want in, they have internships specifically for, and I really hate this word, but BAME kind of people, people from BAME backgrounds. They have they do deals with universities, graduate schemes and programs, all of these things, which kind of feels a bit weird to criticise those things. We don't need those things. We shouldn't be encouraging people of colour. Obviously, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the way they work in the current in the current state of affairs isn't great. So, firstly, I argue they don't just work. They don't work. Oh, for fuck's sake! Right, okay, here we go. They reproduce whiteness, obviously. Basically, one of the things I argue is that these diversity initiatives, they have an ideological function. They are a way of managing the demands of minorities while keeping the status quo intact. Yes, you are encouraged to apply for a job, and you might even get that job. But once you're in the business, once you're in the organisation, once you're in the company, to what extent can you really be yourself, or to what extent are you required to conform to whiteness? To what extent do you feel like you're a disruptive presence and you're there? Not the last thing you want to do is rock the boat. Whiteness loves nothing more than more people of colour within the organisations that they run, which then reaffirm their power, their dominant position. Often as well, you'll be asked to kind of perform your otherness in a way that is acquiescent with the whiteness that is running the show. Sarah Ahmed is obviously really good on that. Secondly, diversity initiatives commodify race. They turn racial and ethnic identities or subjects into commodities to be bought and sold, right? They're kind of, not in the literal sense, but I mean, look, think about it. When you apply for university, literally every single university website, I don't know if you open a prospectus anymore, but every single university website you went to, the front page presented, like from the University of Plymouth to University of Dundee, multiracial utopias, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? The way in which people of colour are used to sell organisations. This happens at university level, it happens in corporate level, everywhere you'll see people of colour. We've gone from invisibility to hypervisibility. I was a student here back in the late 90s, I actually went to find it in the library the other day. I featured in the prospectus at university like 3 times. I don't think they noticed it, but I was in it literally 3 times. There was me at a mixing desk. There was me in the canteen chatting to my friends. There was me in the library picking up a book from a bookshelf. It was it's insane. Honestly, I don't think they noticed. I mean, I was much slimmer then, definitely. I was much more handsome, but still, I don't think they noticed. And so, diversity initiatives commodify race. They turn racial identity into a value that is to be extracted. Sometimes the person of colour can extract that value, their racial value, from themselves, but mostly it's done, like I said, for the white dominant culture, if you like. Herman Gray. Has anyone read any Herman Gray? Herman Gray is boss. He's in America, and I think he writes post Stuart Hall. He writes the best stuff on the politics of representation, and what he criticises in a chapter that he wrote on precarious diversity is that what the cultural industries do, they work with this logic that 11% of the population are ethnic minorities, so we need to get 11% in our workforce, and then we reflect on. And he's arguing. He calls it the demography and representation approach. It's about attaining racial parity, and he's saying, well, that's false. That's a problematic approach, not least in reduction to numbers, and also, and this is where I kind of come in, is that it kind of assumes that once in, people of colour can really make a difference. They can transform work cultures. They can transform, in the context of the cultural industries, they can transform the ways in which they are represented, their communities are represented, whoever the hell they're representing are represented. And as I want to show today, I think that is a problematic assertion and actually couldn't be further from the truth. Not least, this is Greg Dyke. I'm not saying Greg Dyke is hideously white. He was the former Director General of the BBC, and this is typical of the demography and representation approach when he says, we understand that the diversity of our people is inextricably linked to achieving our creative ambitions on diversity. And more diverse our staff, the more able we are to deliver broader diversity of characters and contributors. Hideously white, he described the BBC, he was at a Christmas dinner with all the management team, and he looked around, there was like 40 of them, and there was just a load of white people, maybe some white women as well, and he described the BBC as hideously white, so that kind of went down in history. I've got this really annoying thing here where I can't see what the next slide is, so that's why I've messed up the... I've done it again. Here we go, got it. So basically I want to challenge the idea that having more minorities in the media will automatically lead to a better representation of those minorities, whatever better means, all right? And that brings me on to this issue, what I want to talk to you today about race in the cultural industries, right? Think about the race in the media. It's really weird because, it's not really weird, it's very interesting, that the topic of race and media representation has kind of fallen out of favour. It's kind of become a little bit unfashionable. Obviously, when Stuart Hall came along and was like at the peak of his power, well, his peak of his power was right up until he died, but certainly in the 90s, where he was really transforming the way we thought about culture and identity and the media, that realised a peak, if you like, a spike in people. All of a sudden, people were taking popular culture seriously, which they hadn't done before. Certainly not sociologists. Popular culture seemed like something that was kind of like, not. If we were, quite frankly, if you want to talk about race and racism, why the hell are you talking about, I don't know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of thing. It was that kind of logic. So Stuart Hall, on the one hand, put popular culture on the map, and he kind of led to a generation of people, not least myself, who really wanted to think about popular culture in particular, but culturally more generally, and why that is really important, not least in helping us understanding the new cultural forms of racism. But nonetheless, after a kind of spike in the late 90s, that research fell out of favour. And I think it fell out of favour for like two reasons. One, well, like I said, popular culture was seen as this trivial thing. It's like entertainment. Why are you studying these things when there's real kind of racial subjugation, real economic exploitation, and real racial violence happening on the streets? Why the hell are you looking at TV shows? Why are you looking at kind of, R&B videos? But also related to that, it was seen as a distraction, again, from the real political work that needs to be done in order to fight kind of the forms of racism that still blight our society. So yeah, popular culture kind of fell out of favour. I think this quote from a sociologist called Claire Alexander, who is someone I really rate actually, but she says it when she's talking about cultural studies, a problem in cultural studies, where she argues that it has become overly fascinated. You caught me? You got me there? Become overly fascinated with the issues of cultural commodification, production and consumption at the expense of people, and the structures of power and material context within culture takes shape. Moreover, and I think this is a really, really interesting line, provocative line. Moreover, I wonder whether in the current climate, this interest in popular culture and commodification, production and consumption is a luxury. It's a luxury we can afford. So looking at the representations of, Asians in the Big Bang Theory, I've read several essays on that topic. But still, it's a sense of, is that a luxury we can afford right now? When we're talking about, murder in the context of like on the streets or in Grenfell, state racism, the continued kind of demonisation of Muslims, and what's the word? Rendition and so on. Illegal forms of torture, all those things. And I think, I don't know about you, I mean, and I'm someone who studies popular culture, and studying the making of popular culture for a living. And, even I'm like, well, yeah, that is a very interesting point. But nonetheless, I do think it does a disservice. I mean, one of the people I turn to is Frantz Fanon, right? And, I'm sure you all know who Frantz Fanon is. Frantz Fanon has got to be perhaps one of the, this was someone who was a philosopher. This was someone who, was a working psychiatrist, but wrote amazing books about what it means to be raced. But not only that, not only was he an academic, but he was also revolutionary. He went to Algeria, for Christ's sake, to get to fight in the Algerian War for War of Independence. So this was someone who was a real kind of radical intellectual in like most truest sense. And in his book, has anyone here read Black Skin, White Masks? Anyone know that book, right? So Black Skin, White Masks is all about, what it's like. He's talking about, he's a former colonial subject. He's from Martinique. He's growing up in this French colony, and he's told in his French education that France is the motherland. So, he's part of this colony. He can see the destruction that colonialism's done, but this kind of jars slightly where the education is received, where he's taught to kind of identify with white French identity. So he goes to France, and this was in the 1950s, I guess 1940s. So he goes to France thinking he's landing in his motherland, he's returned. But then he encounters a child and a mother, like white child and mother, walking down the street, and the child points at him and says, and I quote badly, "Mama, a Negro, I'm scared." And he talks about how this kind of, what a dissembling what's the word? I'm discombulating, kind of. That's not the word. But what effect it has on his corporeal state, on his body. Like he talks about very vividly about his identity, like shattering. He never felt his racial identity before. He never felt it. You know, he grew up in a colonial society. He was told that he was a part of French society, but all of a sudden he feels the weight of his race weigh down on him. Stuart Hall said something very similar when he moved to the UK in the 50s. Again, he's brought up in Jamaica. You know, part of the British Empire. This is the motherland. I'm returning home, and it's only when he literally lands in the UK, in England, that he feels his weight just kind of like weigh down on him. So Frantz Fanon talks about this in really vivid, beautiful terms. You should definitely check out his book, Black Skin, White Masks. And you know, he's kind of influenced and shaped media and cultural studies, not least kind of psychoanalytical approaches to understanding the psychosocial violence and damage committed by racism. One of the things about his books, though, about Black Skin, White Mask, which gets really neglected, is he writes about the media a lot. He writes about comic books. He writes about Tarzan films. He writes about children's songs. And these songs, and these kind of texts, which are a product of empire, which are kind of made by French cultural industries, they flood colonial societies, leading what he says, like leading kind of young black people to identify. When you watch, so he's saying, if you're in Martinique, right, in the Caribbean, and you're young and black and you're watching a Tarzan film, what he's saying is, you know, that's all you have. You immediately, as any child would do, you identify with the hero. Just so happens that the hero in nearly all these instances are white. And so he says that once you kind of then go into Western society, you feel the weight ascribed onto you. It's a really jarring effect. All of a sudden, you've identified with the white hero all of a sudden, and then you realise that you're actually seen as the savage who Tarzan is beating off with his club, you know? And so he talks about media a lot, and one of the things he talks about is Mickey Mouse comics, which is really weird. So you've got this guy, Frantz Fanon, who's this radical, intellectual revolutionary. He's talking about fucking Mickey Mouse comics, some of the swearing. And he says, and he kind of preempts. So in light of Claire Alexander's quote, he preempts that criticism. Like, why are you looking at comics? He says, I should be told that this is highly important, but only because those who say it have not given much thought to the role of such magazines. So this is the first thing I want to say about why I think media is a matter of social justice. Cultural representation is a matter of social justice. Not least because for people of colour, not being able to identify in the media, not to be able to see yourself other than in the mirror or in your immediate community, actually has psychosocial effects. So I don't mean that in a kind of really basic media effectsy kind of way, but it plays a big role in how you understand yourself and the world around you. It plays a big role for dominant white culture in terms of reinforcing its own position. You know, Stuart Hall says popular culture is a battlefield. It's a battlefield where the struggle for hegemony is fought over. And as a result, you know, this stuff matters. As Stuart Hall himself says, the cultural industries do have the power constantly to rework and reshape what they represent, and by repetition and selection to impose and implant such definitions of ourselves as to fit more easily the descriptions of the dominant or preferred culture. That is what the concentration of cultural power, the means of culture making in the hands of the few, actually means. So that goes back to my point originally. This notion of concentration of cultural power, this notion of the means of culture making in the hands of the few. This stuff matters for Stuart Hall, and it certainly matters for people of colour generally, I argue. So, that is why media matters, or media is a matter of social justice. Everyone with me so far, yeah? Wicked. If you've got any questions, just do interrupt, I really don't mind. But, that being the case, that discussion of media and cultural representation in popular culture, I believe, has stalled, right? And I don't think it's been adequately kind of really pursued. Because, quite frankly, you have two different kinds of, what am I saying here? we have different ways of trying to, okay, if we understand that race, media, and social justice is a matter of social justice, how best to analyse it? Because the problem with those kind of textual accounts, well, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but textual accounts by themselves, analysing a media text by itself, I feel like actually doesn't really take us very far. and this is a problem I have with cultural studies as someone who is a cultural studies guy. Hello, you're right. Hey guys. So yeah, one of the problems with a sociological approach to race is that it admits, as I say, a question of media and power. It's very much influenced either by race relations paradigm. It's interested in race and racism in the everyday. It's interested about race and racism at institutional levels, in education, in the legal system, and other spheres. Can't think of any. There's got to be more. Schools, education, they're the same thing. Education, law, religion, politics, obviously a policy. But like I said, they tend to leave out questions of media and popular culture, in my view. Cultural studies of race, on the other hand, almost focus too much on representation and leave out really important questions like structure. Like, what is the context within which these representations are taking place? In the context of media studies, you have a political economy approach that is interested in structure, but then it's not really, so it's interested in questions like media ownership, media concentration, who owns the media, how do they use the media to benefit their own ends. But in that research, they tend to overprivilege issues of class and tend to leave out questions of race and popular culture altogether. So basically, so bearing all that thing in mind, right, so where have we come to? Race and how racial and ethnic minorities are represented in the media does matter. While it can be seen as trivial, I argue that actually it's a matter of social justice. And also building on that, I work very strongly with Stuart Hall's idea that popular culture is a battlefield. It's a struggle for where the struggle for hegemony takes place. But thirdly, bearing those two things in mind, I think the way we approach race and media is actually very limited at the moment. Because, like, from a sociological perspective, from a cultural studies perspective, and from a political economy perspective. So I argue we need a new theoretical framework. No, students love to hear about theoretical frameworks. Well, this is mine. I call it the cultural industry's approach to race, and it's a way of thinking through. It's a way of thinking through the text. It's a way of thinking through representation. It's a way of thinking through text and representation as embodied in cultural commodities. But also, it's interested in structure. So it's interested in capitalism, the dynamics of cultural production under capitalism. It's interested in how legacies of empire shape the culture industries and cultural production. And it's also, so you've got tech, you've got the micro, you've got the macro, and I'm also interested in that stuff in between, like the labour behind who makes these representations, you know, who makes cultural commodities. So one of the key terms I work with is this term racialised governmentalities, which is coined by a very famous, brilliant sociologist, cultural theorist called Barnett Hesse. And I remember I worked with this in my book, and then I was like, you know, like you guys, you write your essay and then you look up your citations afterwards. And I was like, racialised government, where did I get that from? So I mean, I remember it was from Barnett Hesse. I couldn't remember the page number. So I went back to the page, and it was just a footnote. It was like a solitary footnote. And he doesn't really talk about what it is, but obviously it really resonated with me a lot. Obviously, there's a bit of Foucault in there. You know, if you're interested in governmentality, it's a very Foucauldian notion. Basically, what Barnett Hesse is trying to get at is the way in which power operates, right? Power operates with regards to race. And Foucault's really useful his concept of governmentality, because what he's saying is that we essentially, very crudely, like relearn race, and then we reproduce it through our actions. That's why, as a bit of a side note, it's always, you know, like when men describe themselves as feminists. I mean, obviously we should all identify as feminists, right? But it seems like it kind of, when I say that, I think it lets me off the hook a little bit too easily and doesn't really account for the way in which I reproduce patriarchy through the way I'm mansplaining to you now what feminism is, right? Do you see what I mean? It's like, and actually, I think governmentality is really useful in thinking about how racist. He actually takes us further. I think he's got a new book coming out. This is an interview. I can send the slides around if you want to, by the way, which has got some of these references. But what he's talking about, essentially, he talks about it now in terms of raceocracy, but racialised governmentalities in his previous work. He describes it as the way in which race, he's not talking about it as a biological description, but as a colonial description. That's very smart. Rules performatively, which is to say the way in which race orders the political and social lives of people without being accountable to any spoken or written discourse, simply because it's performed as a shared social and institutional orientation. So how we perform race, how we perform it, and as we do so, how we then racialise the world around us. in a way that we're not necessarily conscious of. It's certainly not written in a guidebook that we're given, when we turn 18 or something. It's like, something that we learn and then we reproduce it as we act. I think that's a really useful concept, certainly in terms of thinking about what I call race making in the cultural industries. This notion of raceocracy or racialized governmentalities explains how the racial order generally remains the same despite our attempts to transform it. Don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom, because one of the other important concepts that I work with is this one from David Hesmanhouch, who's a very famous media industry scholar. And he talks about cultural commodification as understood as complex, ambivalent, and contested. Let me explain that to you. Theodore Adorno, right? We all know Adorno, our mate Adorno. Commodification is a bad thing. The problem that with capitalism is that it's commodified culture. Culture was this beautiful, autonomous, pure thing that was going to show us the way. It was going to lead us to utopian futures. It was going to show us critical thinking and make us kind of realise the ways in which we're being kind of suppressed and oppressed by kind of industrialist capitalists and the status quo. Those bastards, they took our culture and they turned it into commodities that we now buy, and not only that, it's created false needs. We don't need these commodities, but we devour them anyway. And they used to, culture used to be this autonomous, pure, modernist thing that, kind of encouraged critical thinking, but now it dumbs down. It just basically, it's kind of pre-digested for us, and basically we subsume these products, we go to work in order to buy more of these products, and then we come home, we consume those products, and, it kind of basically leads to our further subjugation, right? So Theodore Adorno sees commodification as an incredibly negative thing, and it's hard not to disagree with that in terms of the way in which something that once didn't have an economic value is now being turned into something with an economic value, which is extracted by the dominant culture who then use it to reinforce their position. Hard to argue with that. But what I like about David Hesmanhouch's argument is that actually he says it's much more complex, ambivalent, and contested than that. Well, look, and this is like, man, we're going to go to like Marx 101 here. You ready for some like hardcore? Karl Marx, right? Obviously, Karl Marx was deeply critical of capitalism. That goes without saying. He saw it as economic exploitation. It kind of exploitation of the worker and so on and so forth. But also, do you know like when Russell Brand gets, I remember that he gets critically spotted with like drinking out of a Starbucks while working on his MacBook. People say, "You fucking hypocrite, right? You call yourself a socialist. Look at the state of you." Well, actually, not to defend Russell Brand necessarily, though I do kind of find it quite entertaining. But Karl Marx, I think, what he was saying is, Karl Marx wasn't saying capitalism shit, we should go back to the way things were. If anything, feudalism, which is what preceded capitalism, was 10 times worse. Because you had no autonomy, you had no free will. You were born into, you were a serf, and that was your lot for the rest of your life. You were owned by the person who owned the kingdom, right? So capitalism, as much as Karl Marx, needless to say, was deeply critical of capitalism, he also saw it had revolutionary tendencies, because it revolutionised the world such that it shifted from feudalism to capitalism. And obviously what he then was going to argue was that capitalism was going to grow and grow and grow, commodify itself, and then eventually it would collapse, and then we'd reach this communist utopia. Whether that's still going to happen, who knows? But nonetheless, he argued that commodification, as the way in which capitalism spread, has this ambivalent quality. On the one hand, it's constraining, it's exploitative, it's destructive, undeniably, but also, very weirdly, it has this revolutionary tendency as well, this revolutionary dynamic, which can actually be incredibly enabling. And I'm going to explain that to you over the course, right at the end. but nonetheless, so I think we need a more nuanced notion of commodification. And so these are the two. Sorry, that's really. I meant to remove that. but I think the two again. It just came out. Again, if I didn't mention it, it'd be totally disingenuous. But two ideas that I come up with is commodification as a technology of racialized governmentalities. So if we remember racialized governmentalities as the way that race reproduces itself through our own actions, right? How we perform it. And I argue that the process of turning something into a cultural commodity, turning a manuscript into a book, turning a screenplay into a film, taking a piece of music into CD vinyl, I don't know, just a commodity in itself. That process of commodification is, I argue, acts as a technology of racialized governmentalities. That process is a way in which power allows for race to be made in a way that reproduces itself. Again, this will make more sense when I'm going to illustrate it in a little while. And also argue that this thing called the racializing logic of capital, which again, I'm going to leave that for a minute because it's really complicated, but I'm going to try and illustrate these two concepts for you by thinking about constraining race-making in the cultural industries. So remember, the cultural industries is the process of commodifying culture. That's what it does. That's why it's an industry, right? Like I said, it takes a screenplay, turns it into a film, takes a manuscript, turns it into a book, takes a piece of music and turns it into a record, right? And I'm going to argue that for racial minorities, this process is deeply damaging. That process of commodification is deeply damaging in lots of different ways. So one of the first things let me just kind of set it up for you. One of the things I'm going to argue against is this notion which is a common held notion within the industry, and it takes us back to the diversity initiative stuff at the beginning. Increasing the number of ethnic and racial minorities in the culture industries will not necessarily improve, whatever the hell that means, the representation of those ethnic and racial minorities, all right? Because what I'm going to argue is that minorities do not have the same creative freedom as their white counterparts. That's one of the central arguments I make. People of colour do not have the same creative freedom in the cultural industries as their white counterparts. I'm going to give you 3 examples of this, right? So this was Swaraj Records. This is my music example. This was a record label that I did some research on very long time ago. This was like mid-2000s now. Swaraj, which incidentally is the Sanskrit word for self-rule, which Gandhi used in the Indian independence movement, was basically an Asian, associated with the genre which everyone hated the title of, the Asian Underground. Anyone familiar with this genre? The Asian Underground, right, was this really interesting moment, not least for me personally speaking, as a brown person, but in the 90s, basically Asian music, you kind of think of Bhangra, you think of Indian classical music, but there wasn't really much else. Like most Asian kids I knew were either into kind of rap and like soul or punk and metal. So that was basically the only things you're into. The Asian Underground was a moment in the 1990s where essentially second generation, i.e. British-born Asians, started creating their own music that fused their love of dance music genres with their cultural heritage. So Talvin Singh, anyone heard of Talvin Singh? No? Nitin Sawhney? No? Anybody? Okay, cool. Okay, that's a few of you. Basically, I guess they were the most famous people. Like, the Talvin Singh won the Mercury Music Prize in '96, so we're not talking obscurity. This is quite big at the time. So basically, they take drum and bass and they like fuse it with like Indian classical music. And they had a famous night at the Blue Note in Hoxton Square, which was on a Monday night. The night before it, Goldie had his famous Metalheads night. So you had this really interesting kind of moment. Very where dance music all of a sudden became very multiracial, and let's face it, dance music still remains a very white scene, but at that time there was some really interesting moments. So Swaraj kind of came out of the, to use an unfortunate phrase, the arse end of that scene in the early 2000s. So they kind of fusing this kind of like Asian kind of. It got a little bit like kind of Bindies, white people with Bindies and dreads turning up, but also it was kind of quite a. For me personally, it was, you saw other kind of brown people who were kind of interesting and different and looked kind of weird. I didn't actually like the music. I just went to look at the girls, I'm sorry to say. But it was, you saw other kind of brown girls who were like just really cool. Obviously, I didn't talk to anyone. But Swaraj was really interesting. So I interviewed them, and basically Swaraj. The problem with this scene is, right, it reached this peak. It became like really popular. It got written about in the Observer, kind of magazine and all those kind of supplements. Like, this is the new Asian cool. Look, the Asian Underground. Ooh, look. And Swaraj basically kind of gained a lot of popularity, or kind of got a lot of media exposure. But at the time of interviewing, we were kind of basically the guy was still living with his parents' house. The record owner, the person who owned the record label. This was kind of typical of a lot of people I interviewed from the scene, but this is something that he was really wary of. we don't want to think of Swaraj as an Asian night, i.e. it's Asian because the people who go there are Asian. That was Ash, who was a label manager. So this is a kind of the double bind, the way in which, on the one hand, it kind of drew from the Asian heritage, but also they didn't want to be defined by their Asianness, right? The double bind. This is the classic double bind that people of colour in particular kind of experience, but you get, again, you can like relate this to class, gender, sexuality, and so on. So yeah, on the one hand, he doesn't really see it, so it was a club night and a record label. Sorry, I should have clarified. It was a club night and a record label, and he was kind of concerned about being pigeonholed. But the fact was that he was struggling. He was struggling to make money. So at the time of the research, he was basically he was in negotiations with Sony Records. Sony Records were interested in doing a kind of distribution deal with him, and so he was really excited. He's like, look, I'm meeting Sony. Hopefully they'll see. And you can kind of, so obviously that involved a lot of the music, but you can see in their kind of aesthetic, kind of where they were going for, this kind of Asian fusion, this kind of futuristic kind of play on a kind of particular aesthetic of Asianness. And you can kind of see it here in this quote. Anyone can see with Swaraj, the brand is strong, the logo's the music, the whole package is there. So I see it as they, i.e. Sony Records, we buying into a ready-made concert. What I argue in this case study is that Swaraj ended up reproducing the very Orientalist aesthetic that they actually set out to challenge in the first place. On the one hand, they didn't want to be seen as an Asian label, but in the process of actually trying to commodify themselves and in a way that made themselves appealing to Sony Records, they did so in a way that reproduced the very Orientalist aesthetic, as I said, that they wanted to challenge. This is a process of self-commodification. It's a process of self-commodification. And this isn't some white people kind of telling them how to do it. This is their own understanding of how things work. This is their own understanding of what they think will appeal. This is their own understanding of the market and the audience and so on. And as I said, in the end, they ended up reproducing the very tropes around Asianness that they set out to challenge in the first place. Racialized governmentalities, right? It's that process of kind of self-commodification that steered them into reproducing the very thing that they wanted to challenge in the first instance. The second one, the second case study, is about book publishing and a piece of technology called BookScan. So one of the things that I found really interesting, you can't really see it here, but basically is the way in which, kind of again, talking about Orientalism, the kind of aesthetic, the Orientalist aesthetic, that like that kind of come over here. The way this is basically this was from Twitter, and someone put it together. Basically, it's book covers around Asianness, right? And it's kind of supposed to be funny. So these covers, so basically they're saying that Asian books around India all get represented in the same way. Profile of a shy woman with lots of exotic jewelry, and you can see those. And the Taj Mahal. Full-on view of mysterious woman with nose rings. My favourite one is barefooted women running or obediently waiting, and the Taj Mahal. And you can see, right? And it's like it's really uncanny. You can't really see it too well, but you can kind of see just the use of colours and so on, and like the motifs are all exactly the same. And one of the things I wanted to know, and again, you can just put that down to the fact is the publishing industry is mostly run by very old white people. That will explain it to an extent. But isn't it a bit, I wanted to see to what extent it's complicated. This actually, you can see the same thing with books set in Africa, that sunset, Serengeti, acacia tree, So what I wanted to find out in this kind of part of the project was why was this happening? And then basically, one of the things I found really interesting was the use of a piece of technology. This is called BookScan. They also do like music scan, which tracks basically, right? I had no idea, but it's kind of ridiculous. The publishing industry, up until BookScan, which I guess was put in place maybe 15 years ago, had no idea how many books they'd sold. What you do is you make, you print like a few thousand, and then you go and do deals with retailers, and they say, okay, we'll take 500 copies off your hand. You send them to, you send a truck, 500 copies of your book to the retailers. But after that, you don't know what they do with them. You don't know how many of them. You assume that the ones that, they say we've got like 100 left. So you assume that's sales, but you don't actually know for sure. They might have given a load out for press purposes, or some of them might have got damaged or lost. So you can never actually tell. So what BookScan did was this amazing piece of technology where essentially it tracks sales. So the minute it goes through a till, it goes into a database. And all of a sudden, publishers could see what they were selling, but also how other books were selling. So this was a really incredible moment. Not least for salespeople. What's really interesting, though, that I found out during my research is how they use this technology to make decisions on what books to acquire, right? So you have an acquisition meeting. You have editors who all come to this acquisition meeting. They've been sent loads of manuscripts, right, from like maybe unknown authors, some known authors, and they come in and they want the publishing house to buy this book. You need to buy this book. It's great, right? And then they'll go in and then they'll basically have a discussion with the other editors, with the CEO, but also with sales and marketing people who have taken an increasingly influential role in the editorial process. And they'll say, right, I want to do, this is a new Asian author from East London. I think this book's going to be great. I think it's going to sell 6,000 copies. So I think, and so it can make us this amount of money. These are the costs. I think we should give them this amount of money as an advance. And this is how much it costs to promote it. And then you do the maths, blah, blah, blah. Where the discussion happens is a salesperson might go, well, actually, 6,000 copies, that's incredibly optimistic. Because if you look at this other book by a first-time Asian author, you'll see it only sold 700 copies, right? And then, so they have an argument about, how many books they think it's going to sell. Well, I think with a big marketing push, we could really blah, blah, blah. Did you see there was that moment, though, where that salesperson says, well, there's another book by this other Asian author that sold this amount? That is the key moment. This is an interview I held with an author an Asian author, and they said. So I said, and I'm talking about his process of using BookScan. So I said to them, so they would take a similar novel to yours and make sales projections based on how well that book sold. And the author says, yes, that's quite a depressing thought. So I say, what book do you think they'll compare to yours? He says, I don't know, Gautam Alkani and Nirpal Singh. They're like two Asian authors who happen to be out at the same time. And who he said he had no affinity to. But he says, if they can get away from the Asian thing, I think they'll be smarter. So basically, in that process of acquisition meeting, that very innocuous, I think this book by this Asian author will sell 6,000 copies, salesperson saying, yeah, but there's this other book by this other Asian author which only sold 600. Like, if I say it quickly, this makes good common business sense, right? But actually, there's a very important assumption being made, essentially, that pigeonholes these authors together. That again, like Swaraj, one of the things when I spoke to authors, they'd all say this. They say, I don't want to be known as an Asian author, I just want to be known as a good author, right? But nonetheless, they found they were constantly being pigeonholed. Here's an interview with a white guy, an editorial director, and he said, if I was a Bangladeshi writer living in London, I'd mention Monica Ali's Brick Lane in my letter. In my opening, at the time, Brick Lane was a massive, massive hit. I'd mention it in my letter, my opening sentence of my letter. To be frank, everything is sold as a cross between. So the best way of getting kind of, having your book bought or acquired is to compare yourself to someone who they will understand as a bit like you, even though it might have nothing to do with Brick Lane, in a way for them to be able to then kind of call up the numbers, look at the data and say, oh yes, no, that did sell 20,000 copies. We could potentially do the same again here. But again, that's what I call the rationalising, racialising logic of capital. It's rationalising because that's the process. You're using data to try and make good decisions. But in that process, even though you're using science, actually you're using very cultural, social assumptions, which actually reproduce, as I say, the idea that Asian authors need to be presented in this way in order for them to fit in the market, in order for them to be successful. They need to have a barefoot woman in a sari running across a marble floor, because that will sell, even though your book might have nothing to do with that. So that's what I call the rationalising, racialising logic of capital. And again, what I'm trying to show you is how the representation of racial and ethnic minorities is shaped by that production process. Last case study. Channel 4 kind of, in my interviews with people who work in television, got criticised immensely for their depiction of Muslims in particular. This is just a selection for my personal archive of, these are quite old, but we've seen even more recent times, we don't really see much change. There's a lot about, Muslims in relation to certain tropes, not least terrorism, their cultural difference, their, as I said, they're all kinds of things. I interviewed this guy. This guy's called Akil Ahmed, who was the head of religion and multicultural programming at Channel 4 at the time. And I asked him, kind of like thinking, well, Muslims don't really come across that well. Wait a minute, you produced them. You're a Muslim guy yourself. All right, okay. So can you maybe describe to me how you go about commissioning these documentaries and programs? And he said, from my point of view, basically we're not going to get out huge ratings as much as we can try. So we do definitely want the program to be noticed. We want it to get written about. We want it to win awards. We want it to have some noise, as they say. So he wants to make noise, which is essentially getting it written about, getting it talked about, maybe winning maybe that leading to some awards. So you forget about ratings. You need to make some noise. And you know what? If you look at the programs he commissioned, he was a British Muslim Pakistani guy, very working class, defiantly working class, didn't go to Oxford, really proud of his roots, right? And really proud of the fact that he made it. And to be honest with you, he was a really, really impressive guy. And he's obviously done really, really well. But, yes, how has he made noise? Well, look at the programs he's kind of commissioned. Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber, The Cult of a Suicide Bomber, Women Only Jihad, The Fundamentalists, putting the fun in fundamental. Obviously, this is a very selective list. But nonetheless, what I'm arguing here is that, there's two things. One, if you actually watch these shows, if you watch these documentaries, some of them are actually really interesting, actually very nuanced, actually really have been made by experts who know these issues really well. But nonetheless, what I argue is that these titles together and the kind of images that go with them construct, they produce a discursive formation, if you like, that reproduces the idea of Islam as something that is absolutely different and totally incompatible with kind of the West, right? That's what this does. It produces, you can see how it's produced noise, but it's a noise that produces a very nasty feedback, if you catch my drift. The other point I'd want to make, though, is that I'm not saying for a second that, as some might do, is Akil Ahmed sold out. He's setting out his Muslim identity in order to get the cushy job and have a role of significance. I think that logic of noise. If you read the whole interview with him, he talks about. I was like, asking how do you commission? Again, that's my interest. He's like, well, you just get a feel. You get a feel for the process. You just get a feel for it. Ideas, they just need to be grabby. If you can get a grabby idea, something you can put on a T-shirt, then you've onto something, right? You just want it to make some noise. Do you know what I mean? And through that language, which is the logic, again, that notion of governmentality, it's not a written down discourse, but something that you just understand, that's the way you do things. I argue it's that process that led to the criticisms that Channel 4 has received for its representation of Muslims in particular. So that's a kind of, again, racialised commodification, turning something into a cultural commodity. That process acting as a form of racialised governmentality, steering race-making in very particular ways that reproduce historical constructions of otherness that seem to emanate from colonial times, as far as I can tell. But remember, I said commodification, this is just to finish off now, commodification has enabling tendencies as well. Remember I said commodification, yes, it's constraining, yes, it's destructive, yes, it's exploitative, but also, according to Karl Marx's more nuanced reading of Marx, it also has enabling tendencies as well. And this is the funny thing about culture production. As much as we can be, I kind of spent my whole career criticising the media for, as this ideological state apparatus that is racist and reproduces racial stereotype. I watch a hell of a lot of TV. You know what I mean? I watch a lot of films. I listen to a lot of music. I don't actually read. I've got 2 children. I don't read any books anymore. But but you know what? I mean, very simply, I know this sounds kind of good, but if it was so racist, if it's so ideological, I wouldn't consume so much of it, honestly. And that is not to say, as well, that everything and it's not only the fact that I consume so much of it, also a lot of it really enriches my life. You know what I mean? It's entertaining, yeah, but also enlightens me. It's taught me a lot, not least about race and racism in this country and beyond. So there are moments where it produces really amazing stuff. And this is why cultural industry's approach is really interesting, because what it draws attention to is this idea that the cultural commodity, it resists homogenization, since the use value is novelty or difference. What he's saying is that media companies would basically love just to churn out the same old shit because it's cheap. You know, this works. Let's just produce more and more of it, right? And they get away with that, to be fair, a lot of the time. But also, as audiences, we crave familiarity, and I will go home tonight and watch another episode of Friends, even though I've seen literally every single episode about a million times. But I also crave, as do all of you, originality, novelty, and difference. So the media can't get away, actually, with churning out the same stuff, because we can quite simply switch off. And so, in the very characteristics of the cultural commodity, in this, where its use value, its novelty or difference or originality, that gives us hope. That gives people of colour in particular an opportunity to do something really radical. Because what else is more novel and original and different than one's racial identity? You know what I mean? So there's opportunities. That explains why Atlanta, by Donald Glover, is not only a massive hit, but was produced on the Fox network, which is run by Rupert Murdoch, right? It explains why Get Out, which is this tiny little indie movie that was made on a shoestring budget, becomes a massive, massive hit. I'm trying to think of a third one because it's nice to list things in three. It explains why. I don't know, but you know what I'm getting at. It explains. There's these moments, whether it's Insecure HBO, it's Janelle Monáe, it's the London jazz scene right now. You know what I mean? It's all these amazing fucking things that are happening in the world around it. There's so much shit, but also there's so much awesomeness. Those are very sociological terms I just used, and they can be explained by the original difference. Let me just use you one more example. You won't remember this documentary. It's a documentary called Bradford Riots, which was made in 2004, I think, and it was a fictional drama of the real-life events that took place in Bradford in 2001, actually, just before 9/11, the summer, just before September 2001. And basically, this was a riot between Asian youth, very working class, specifically mostly Pakistani Muslim youth, and the police. The far right did a march in Bradford, antagonised everyone, ran away, and basically led to this battle between the police and young Asian youth. There's been a history of race riots in this country. What made this one stand out is that the Asian youth who got arrested were given disproportionately huge sentences, like huge, way more than any other young person who'd been involved in a similar kind of protest, riot, whatever. And so that guy there, that's Saha, what's his face? I forget his name. But the guy on the left is Neil Bishash, who's the director. And basically, it's an incredible documentary, a film actually, which shows A, the brutality of the police, A, calls out the state, the kind of racism of the legal system, and 3, just exposes the gross injustice that happened following this riot. So it's an amazing documentary. It was produced by Channel 4. Neil was a first-time director, and they gave him over £1 million to make a 2-part drama on this show, and it was incredible. And I asked him, what, and there was moments as well where they were trying to film the riot scene, but no local council would agree to film it for not obvious reasons at all, actually, but for reasons which you can imagine. And Channel 4 one point were going to put in another $500,000 in order to create a set, so they were fully behind it. And I asked him why. And what was clear, Channel 4 has a public service remit where it has to kind of cater for the nation's diverse communities. That definitely was it. But what Neil suggested was actually it's because of Channel 4's brand. Channel 4's brand is all about attracting young urban youth. That's essentially its target audience. And so Bradford Riots for them became a really neat way to reinforce their kind of cutting edge radical nature at a time where, like I said, they were getting criticised for the representation of Muslims and for kind of leaving behind some of the kind of social issue films that it used to do so well. So actually, Bradford Riots wasn't enabled by a public service remit, but a highly capitalistic one, i.e. trying to fulfil Channel 4's brand as edgy, urban and youthful. Do you see what I mean? So again, commodification, this was a process of turning a story into something that would makes money through advertising, commodity that makes money through advertising, was actually enabled by a highly capitalistic attitude. So what I'm basically arguing is that enabling race-making in the cultural industries is not about increasing the number of minorities in the creative field, but it's relaxing tight control. One of the things that I argue in the book is that, black and brown people, they have less creative freedom than their white counterparts, but also, in the same token, they're controlled more tightly. You are seen as a risk. You're a risky investment, so we really need to pay attention to you to make sure that we can optimise the amount of money we make from you. So it's about relaxing tight control, and that's through policy, I argue. As I'll come back to that, but also critically reflexive industry practice. What I'm getting at here is that basically this is obviously racism is entrenched in society. You're not just going to, counter racialized governmentalities. But one of the things, and so it needs basically these tactics at the structural level, which I won't bore you with, different types of policy. I think policy that enables independent cultural production, I think is really, really useful. But also it's about workers to almost kind of create their own kind of guerrilla warfare kind of tactics, if you like. A politics of production where you kind of are aware of what's going to happen to your work and you've got to try and counter it at every point. So for any of you who want to work in the cultural industries, I think that's really important to understand exactly how the industry works in order to just evade those practices, or maybe work with them in a way that would enable your practice. One of the things I'm not going to talk about now, but I think we need to replace the language of diversity, which I think is incredibly neoliberal, with a language of reparation, actually. I think reparation. If colonialism was about symbolic violence as it was about physical violence, then I think a way of redressing that is by giving people of colour the means of cultural production, right? But I'll save that for another day. But essentially what I'm thinking about is a way of making race while contributing to its undoing. I've got a cheesy conclusion slide. It's not enough to look at text in isolation. Cultural industries steer minorities in producing racial reductive tropes. But it also very leaves spaces where interventions can be held as well. And that's what makes the cultural industries, I think, such a fascinating thing to study. So thanks everyone. Bless you. I've got, do you want to talk about stuff? There's so many questions that you want to ask or raise? Yeah.
I was kind of thinking about the whole popular culture thing when you mentioned it. And one of the things that really got me thinking, when Black Panther came out at the start of the year, they kind of made this big thing, like, finally, this film's happened and all of that. And I kind of feel like there were a lot of people who went, I don't know, it was weird, like, because where I come from isn't the
Wakanda?
No, I don't. I come from North Kent, which is the only place to have a UKIP constituency.
I know it well, yeah.
So I felt like a lot of people went there out of white guilt. And what I thought about that film was that it did very well, but I kind of feel like people made a bigger deal of it. Yeah. And I don't know whether that
well, look, I mean, I bang on about this a lot. Well, I mean, the fascinating thing about Black Panther was, like, if you take away, apart from the admittedly huge fact that it's an all-black cast, save for a couple of white saviours in there, but, apart from that, there was actually nothing radical about the production whatsoever. It's like an incredibly generic superhero movie in terms of the way, and I mean generic not in terms of what it meant, but in terms of the way it was produced, the amount of money that went into it, the kind of CGI that was used, the kind of way it was formatted, the way it was marketed, the way it was promoted. Essentially exactly the same, like every other superhero. But, let's face it, we're all black cast, and some incredibly interesting women characters in particular. I mean, I don't think that's not a criticism. That's not a criticism of it all. And one of the things you can't deny, I don't know what's going on with the light in there. One of the things you can't deny is the affective response it provoked. Certainly with people with communities of colour across the world. Literally the bodily. I watched it, and there were, I live in Hackney, and I went. It was kind of a mixed audience, and you kind of, you see the young black kids coming out, like 2 inches taller, so undeniably it meant something. But I think that kind of backs up my point about the enabling properties of commodification. Like, it was a cultural commodity in its crudest sense, its most extreme sense. There's that, I remember seeing the toy ad for it, and it had black kids in it, and that blew my mind. You never see that. You never see black kids advertising anything. And again, it's like, okay, I understand the Frankfurt School, I understand the argument about false needs and these, I don't need this Nerf gun, but it's like, but nonetheless, there's something, that it has, the politics of representation is so complex, but I think just the sheer affective power of that was really interesting. But Black Panther was really, that's what I mean. Yeah.
I was really curious if you could expand a bit on the thing about creativity and like creative power, and the idea that people of colour might not have as much of it.
Yeah, good.
So, like in the past, I like to have quite a sort of universal view of creativity.
Yeah.
As if it was something which everyone had.
Yeah.
I think that's quite important to acknowledge.
No, that's a really good question. I think, creative freedom. I think that's something I'm really, really interested in. And I just found that people of colour didn't have it, or not to the same extent. The thing about cultural industries, right? We've got this very romantic notion of the artist that still takes hold in society, where the artist basically you need to leave them alone in order for them to create their through their genius. You don't go into a studio and tell Kendrick Lamar you don't have enough hits in it because you're right. You're something to catchy a verse. Do you know what I mean? You don't do that. You let people, and I know that's a bad example, but that's a personal colour. But you do need to give cultural producers autonomy, right? That's absolutely fact. And I think that does, and I think black and white do probably at that level of conception probably do have similar levels of creativity, but it's what happens afterwards. That process of rationalisation, bureaucratisation, because cultural production is incredibly risky. You don't know what you're going to have a hit in your hand. You can have the biggest, you could be a studio, the biggest budget, the hottest director, the biggest new star, as I said, the biggest budget, and and you could create something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a hit. You can't guarantee it, right? And so you've got to give your culture producer autonomy. You need to give the artist autonomy, creative freedom. But then after that, that's when the control comes in. You market it in a particular way. You distribute it in a particular way. Maybe you'll kind of intervene in the artistic process and try and lead it in a different way. And that's where people of colour, I find, that's when they really feel the weight of the culture industry on them. They're subjected to much tighter forms of control because you're seen as a riskier business. Well, a film with a black lead, it's not really going to sell in China or Germany. You know what I mean? It's that kind of logics that you're having to contend with. Logics that become really common sense, but in actual fact are not. And they're time and time again they're being contradicted over and over again. But the industry still, because it's still owned by the same people, still hold on to the ideas. So then while they might have similar levels of creative freedom right at the beginning of conception, they're subjugated to greater forms of creative control. That's why I argue. And obviously there's ways of evading it. The more independent you are, the more DIY you can be, then you can evade all of that. But then obviously that comes with a downside as well, because you can't reach the same kind of audiences. Tiny little indie, do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think so. Thank you. Yeah.
So obviously this is America, being used to
yeah.
Massive. And what was it that woman said? Well, is it a luxury we can afford when we're talking about kind of race in the media and the cultural industries? But with This Is America, is it now, I feel, are we at a point where it's not a luxury that we're able to afford, but it's a necessity that we need to discuss?
Yeah.
Like, do you think it's now coming about like that, and people are seeing race in that way?
Yeah, no, I think so. But let me turn this on to you guys. I mean, do you think that kind of critique can exist in the commodity form? It's a music video, it's there to sell records, right? Does that undermine it? I don't know. I'm trying to.
I don't know, because it's hard to think about because you have to detach the song, I think, from the video.
Yeah.
The song and the video are made for two very different reasons, I feel, or like they're different commodities.
Yeah.
So the video was made to have a message. I don't think the video was made to make money or sell.
Yeah.
I think that was to be like, bam.
Yeah. And
then what happens when it becomes a commodity and it's a CD that people pay like, or they pay like 99p to download it, is very different to what happens with like the visual imagery of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. Yeah, it definitely feels
Yeah.
like it was made as a statement. I'm
Yeah.
also, I I mean, can I change the subject a little bit to use another example? Can we? I hope this is all right, but it kind of relates. I want to watch Stormzy.
Which Stormzy?
This is Stormzy at the Brits.
Oh, with Grandpa.
Yeah. Whoa. You can't see it. Sorry, and that was really loud as well. So let's just fix that. Oh man, where's it gone? Let's just watch it in case for people who haven't seen it.
I'm a little tip on my pen show. Like, yo, Theresa May, where's that money for Grenfell? What you thought we just forgot about Grenfell? You criminals, and you got the trick to call us savages. You should do some jail time, you should pay some damages. You should burn your house down and see if you can manage this. And please be cold, we just smoke a bit of cannabis. So, don't get me for this, so people. This year I'm dishing out L's and free smoke. They tell us that we're fucks, I try and bust a myth. But someone told the Daily Mail they can sum up.
So like, okay, don't need to watch that again. Andrew Hagen in the London Review of Books, did anyone read that? That London Review, he wrote about Grenfell, it's an amazing piece, but in it, he talks about Stormzy as being the latest in the long line of opportunist pop stars who kind of, you know, in this instance, use Grenfell to sell more records.
He thinks that's an opportunist pop star.
I mean, yeah, I guess so. I'm guessing by the tone of your voice, you disagree. Is that right?
It's hard because he's seizing an opportunity.
Yeah.
But whether or not he's seizing an opportunity as a pop star or as a black British male are two very different things. And I think what he's saying there is as a black British male,
Yeah.
you know, is using a platform and not as a pop star abusing a platform, essentially.
Anyone else want to? Yeah, no, I think that's all right. Anyone else want to share their thoughts?
I think that obviously might quite something to what you said, but just using the platform because he, from 2014 onwards, he's had this hugely mainstream audience.
Yeah.
That has somehow, as Stormzy is the kind of poster boy of grime.
Yeah.
It's because of him that grime's kind of spread to Australia and America and different places. And now he can use that platform to kind of start discussion. And I'm sure, I don't know how many views this video has got, but I wonder how many people can see that.
Yeah.
Maybe taking it to heart.
Can I go on?
It's interesting because grime is a genre that has been, like with most kind of like black music, I guess, it's made for white, well, it's taken and appropriated by white audiences. It's like most people that were buying hip hop records in the US and like the noughties were white middle class, not actually like working class. And a similar thing kind of happened with grime here.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Stormzy is so aware of his like audience and like the range of demographics, but doesn't, he kind of vocalizes that disparity between audiences in a really clever way.
Yeah.
And like the statements he makes, he's aware that he's not hating on like white people, white culture. He's saying like there's still stuff that needs to be discussed.
Yeah,
there's still
racial injustice.
Yeah, racial injustice is going on, which I think is so important.
Yeah, I think I've got to bring up this. Have you seen this video of it all? You'll study music, don't you? So you know what we're talking about.
Der Vietnamkrieg solidarisierte die Menschen durch das Fernsehen. Die US Army erobert ein Bauerndorf und zündet es an, vor den Augen der Welt. Das Fernsehen brachte Bilder ins Wohnzimmer, die niemand bestimmt hatte und die jeder innerlich kommentieren musste, ob er wollte oder nicht. Hatte das sofort durchschaut.
Ich glaube allerdings, dass Versuche, politischen Protest mit der Popular Music, also mit der Unterhaltungsmusik, zusammenzubringen, deshalb zum Scheitern verurteilt sind, weil die ganze Unterhaltungsmusik, auch sie irgendwie modernistisch sich aufputzt, so mit dem wahren Charakter, mit dem Amüsement, mit dem Schielen nach dem Konsum verbunden ist. dass also Versuche, dem eine veränderte Funktion zu geben, ganz äußerlich bleiben. Und ich muss sagen, wenn also dann irgendjemand sich hinstellt und auf eine im Grunde doch schnulzenhafte Musik dann irgendwelche Dinge darüber singt, dass Vietnam nicht zu ertragen sei, dann finde ich, dass gerade dieser Song nicht zu ertragen
so
ist.
You get the gist. I mean, so taking something horrendous and make it somehow consumable ends up wringing something like consumption qualities out of it. Yeah, I mean, look, Adorno like represents the pretty extreme, and to be fair to him, incredibly sophisticated take on what consumption, the commodification of culture means. I guess for the Grenfell, with Stormzy thing, I guess what I'm interested in is how like the format of grime lends itself to do that kind of intervention, right? Almost, he would have been denying the genre if he hadn't made that statement. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's what the culture industry's perspective does. It kind of makes you realise that grime as a genre is formatted in a particular way. And yeah, it kind of maybe to a really kind of Adorno-esque kind of thinker, it might be seen as a cynical opportunism. But I don't know.
If the Grenfell event though, because Graham obviously is from North London, and Grenfell is in Surrey.
East, no, it's east, is it? Road.
Around there. I was going to say, but if it wasn't from, if this didn't happen in London, would it then feel as disingenuous if they didn't?
Yeah.
Because it's more localised.
Yeah, maybe.
I guess it gets a bit like tied up with authenticity as well, and sort of judging the intentions of an artist, which I think is especially difficult in the consumer realm. Like the artist is already wearing a mask or making one.
Yeah.
Like the way that they're presented as well.
That's a really good point. Do you know what? Can I just show you one more clip? I've got a skedaddle in a minute, but I just want to show you one more clip, which is which I just
indem das Entsetzliche.
Sorry, Teddy. Shut up for a minute. Hold on a minute. I want to show you. There's this clip from where is it? Louis Theroux, right? Louis Theroux. You all know who Louis Theroux is, right? He did. Is that it?
There's someone from Britain.
So he did. He you know his Weird Weekends, right? He did these Weird Weekends. Does anyone know that series where he'd go around to a weird kind of subcultural group and hang out with them? He went in one episode. He goes to New Orleans to hang out with some like southern rappers, and his whole shtick is he's trying to make it as a rapper. Could I be a gangster rapper? So he's written this rap, and he's gone, and this is him meeting a designer, someone who designs rap records. And so this is just a clip from it, which I edited in a very dodgy way.
There's someone from Britain. It's quite shocking to see how much.
So, by the way, the context is the guys showed him around all the artwork that he's produced, and then the stories behind him. Oh, this rapper, he's in jail for killing, the blah 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 blah. So this is where Louis takes off.
There's someone from Britain. It's quite shocking to see how much kind of death and legal problems there is in these artists' lives.
Right.
Do you feel like any responsibility, like in as much as these pictures do glamorize that?
A little bit, yes.
Yes.
My major concern for my clients is to make sure that it sells. That's what I'm here for. I make sure that the stuff sells. Is there anything on the walls that tickles your fancy?
It's kind of grim and somber. I want to sort of go for something a bit realer and a bit more to do with me, if possible.
Okay, we'll start the sketching process up.
Okay.
And we'll see what you can do. Okay. Television's behind you.
But also, the microphone to indicate this is what,
Right, exactly.
I enjoy glasses of red wine. Oh, I have a nice computer. I wear glasses, a little bit of a trademark. Cats, I like cats. Stroking a cat. Tickling a cat. Scratching its ears. That's nice. I notice you're steering me towards something a little harder.
Right.
Why?
Because that's a demographic that's going to buy this stuff. White 14-year-old girls at the shopping mall spending their $40 every weekend on rap music to piss off mom and dad. That's who's making these men millionaires. Almost finished. Almost done. Where's my customer?
Can I? Oh, yes.
Yes?
Look at that. We've got the wine. We've got the women. The cat. The cat's now become kind of a James Bond villain sort of motif.
Yes, he's overtaken your villain.
You've actually managed to take my elements, which were kind of like sort of like, you're supposed to be sort of cuddly and sort of gentle, and turn them into sort of a Machiavellian figure, haven't you?
Yes.
And with a sort of new
cat-loving gangster is what you're right, exactly.
In all seriousness, that's just what the market demands.
It's what works. It's what works out here. Get that
Thank
down?
you so much. The Rap Chronicle continue.
Yeah, what the market demands, you know, you've steered me in this direction, that kind of illustrates exactly what I'm talking about. And how the racialisation of the cultural commodity, the sexualisation as well, let's not forget, questions of racialisation always involve questions of gender and sexuality as well. And I think, this I think really just neatly encapsulates. And I think we can read the Stormzy thing as, like, again, it's the format of grime lent himself, you know, it's so staged, you know, with the shower and the spotlight. But then also, I think it was, you know, personally, I think it was an amazing cultural political intervention, actually. And I think if you talk about hegemony, about popular culture, struggle for hegemony, I think it pulled it. I think it helped pull it in a particular direction. The enabling qualities of commodification, you know, that was a highly commodified moment. But actually, something radical can also appear in it, if albeit only for a moment. Sorry guys, I've got to head off. So thank you very much for coming today. Thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.